Ethan's life was a balancing act between chaos and control. As a travel vlogger, he thrived on unpredictability, yet he craved the structure of routine. He spent his days traversing unfamiliar cities, filming forgotten places, and weaving narratives about their decay. But no matter where he went, certain constants tethered him. The warm brew of morning coffee, the weight of his camera in hand, and the quiet hours spent editing until sleep claimed him. This morning started much the same as any other. Ethan woke to the creak of old wooden floors and the groan of a radiator struggling against the chill. His current apartment, rented for the week, was perched on the edge of a small, unremarkable town. From his window, he could see a park blanketed in frost, its skeletal trees silhouetted against a pale, gray sky. After a brief shower and a longer battle with the temperamental coffee machine, Ethan sat down with his mug and opened his laptop. The glow of the screen illuminated his face as he scrolled through local blogs in search of the day's destination. One post caught his eye: an abandoned train station on the outskirts of town. Its rusted iron beams and shattered windows promised the perfect blend of history and decay his audience loved. "This one's going to be good," he murmured, sipping his coffee. The road to the station was a lonely one, winding through barren fields and overgrown thickets. The town seemed to thin out the closer he got, its outskirts marked by crumbling brick walls and graffiti-covered signs. The train station loomed ahead, its silhouette rising like a monument to forgotten times. Ethan parked his car and stepped out, pulling his jacket tighter against the wind. The building was larger than he had imagined, its roof partially collapsed and its walls thick with ivy. He paused to film the exterior, capturing the interplay of light and shadow as the morning sun broke through the overcast sky. Inside, the air was damp and heavy with the scent of mildew. Ethan moved cautiously, his boots crunching against broken tiles. The remnants of benches and ticket counters hinted at the station's former purpose, though time had all but erased its identity. He set up his camera and began narrating, his voice echoing faintly in the cavernous space. "Places like this are time capsules," he said, panning across a row of shattered windows. "They hold stories that history forgot, waiting for someone to listen." As the hours passed, Ethan lost himself in the rhythm of filming. He framed shots of rusted tracks disappearing into the horizon, intricate graffiti sprawling across crumbling walls, and the soft interplay of light filtering through the gaps in the roof. It wasn't until he sat down to review the footage that he noticed something strange. In one clip, far in the background, a shadow stood partially obscured by a pillar. Ethan frowned and replayed the clip. The figure was faint, almost blending into the darkness, but unmistakably human-shaped. He glanced over his shoulder at the room behind him, but it was empty. "Probably a trick of the light," he muttered, though unease prickled at the edges of his mind. That evening, Ethan returned to his apartment, weary but satisfied. He transferred the day's footage to his laptop and settled in to edit. The glow of the screen cast sharp shadows across the room as he combed through hours of video, piecing together the narrative. When he reached the clip with a shadowy figure, he paused. The image was clearer now, its edges more defined. The figure stood motionless, partially hidden but undeniably present. Ethan's fingers hovered over the keyboard. "This doesn't make sense," he whispered. He replayed the clip, zooming in on the figure. Its features were indistinct, blurred like a smudged reflection. Yet something about it felt deliberate, as if it were aware of being observed. The unease from earlier returned, stronger now, coiling tight in his chest. Ethan shut his laptop and leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. He told himself it was nothing, a glitch in the footage, a shadow cast by something he hadn't noticed. But the rationalizations felt hollow. That night, Ethan's sleep was restless. He dreamed of the train station, its corridors stretching endlessly into darkness. The shadowy figure appeared in every turn, standing silently, watching. Each time he approached, it disappeared, only to reappear closer. He woke in the early hours of the morning, drenched in sweat and gasping for air. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the radiator. Ethan sat up and glanced at his laptop, the frozen frame of the figure still displayed on the screen. He couldn't leave it alone. He had to go back. Ethan couldn't shake the image of the shadowy figure. As he scrolled through his footage the next morning, his mind refused to let it go. He'd captured hours of video, meticulously shot from every angle of the abandoned train station, but that one frame, where the figure stood near the pillar, nagged at him. "It's nothing," he muttered to himself. "Just a trick of the light. Or someone passing by, right?" But his rationalizations fell hollow. The station had been empty. He was certain of that. He'd filmed for hours and seen no one. Ethan leaned back in his chair, staring at the frozen frame of the figure on his laptop. Something about its posture, rigid, unnatural, made him shiver. He considered cutting the footage, omitting the figure entirely. But part of him wanted answers. Maybe someone online could explain it. Ghost enthusiasts would eat it up, and skeptics would tear it apart. Either way, it would get views. With a sigh, Ethan included the clip in his next video, titling it "Forgotten Places: The Haunting of the Train Station." When the video went live later that day, Ethan sat in his cluttered apartment, refreshing the comments section obsessively. The video gained traction quickly, as his videos often did. Comments rolled in. "This place looks amazing. Definitely on my list. Love the editing, man. The vibes are immaculate." And then, buried among the praise, "Did anyone else see that thing near the pillar at 427? Bro, there's someone in your shot. Creepy A." Ethan's stomach dropped. He scrolled faster, skimming for more mentions of the figure. "Who's the shadowy dude in the background? Freaked me out. I swear that wasn't just a trick of the light." By nightfall, Ethan's unease had grown into a gnawing anxiety. He replayed the clip over and over, pausing at the exact frame where the figure appeared. He zoomed in as far as the resolution allowed, but the closer he got, the less sense it made. The figure wasn't obscured by shadows. It seemed to be made of them. The following morning, Ethan returned to the station. He told himself it was just to film a follow-up. The comments were already demanding more, and revisiting the location would make for great content. But deep down, he knew it wasn't about the video. He needed to know. The station felt different this time. The air was heavier, the light dimmer despite the overcast sky. Ethan moved cautiously, his camera rolling as he retraced his steps from the previous shoot. "Back again," he muttered to himself, his voice barely above a whisper. "Let's see what you've got for me." As he filmed, the station's silence became oppressive. Every creak of the floorboards under his boots echoed endlessly. He set up his tripod near the same pillar where the figure had appeared, his hands trembling as he adjusted the lens. "Come on," he said under his breath, glancing over his shoulder. The emptiness around him felt alive, as if it were watching. Hours passed without incident. No shadows moved, no strange shapes appeared in his viewfinder. But the feeling of being watched never left him. Ethan left the station that day with nothing new to show for it. But the unease had burrowed deeper. That evening, Ethan set up a live stream from his apartment, hoping to distract himself. His audience loved these impromptu sessions, where he answered questions and shared behind-the-scenes stories about his shoots. "Hey everyone," he said, forcing a smile as the chat filled with eager viewers. "So, I've got some crazy footage coming your way soon. The station was, well, let's just say it was interesting." Comments flooded the screen. "Did you see the shadow guy again? Tell us about the pillar. Spooky vibes." Ethan laughed nervously, rubbing the back of his neck. Yeah, I know. The shadow thing freaked me out too. But I didn't see anything new today. It's probably just, I don't know, pareidolia or something." Then a comment appeared that made him freeze. "Who's standing behind you?" His smile faltered. He glanced at the chat, the words blurring together as more comments poured in. "Dude, seriously, turn around. WTF, there's someone behind you." Slowly, Ethan turned his head toward the window behind him. The reflection in the glass was faint but unmistakable. The shadowy figure stood in his apartment, motionless. Ethan shot out of his chair, the live stream still running as he spun around. But the room was empty. When he turned back to his monitor, the reflection was gone. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. He sat in the dim glow of his laptop, replaying the live stream footage over and over. The figure's presence was undeniable. It hadn't just been in his reflection. It had been in the room with him. His apartment, once a place of comfort, now felt foreign and hostile. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the radiator, set his nerves on edge. He combed through his old footage, desperate to find some pattern or explanation. And that's when he saw it. The figure wasn't new. It had been there all along, lurking in the background of videos he'd shot months ago, in cities hundreds of miles apart. In one clip, it stood on a distant hilltop. In another, it was barely visible by the edge of a foggy lake. Always still, always watching. Ethan shut his laptop, his breath shallow. He realized with chilling clarity that this wasn't just a glitch or a coincidence. The figure had been following him for a long time. Ethan's world felt smaller now, constricted by the figure's looming presence. No matter where he went, no matter what he filmed, it was always there. The background of his videos had become a gallery of unease, darkened alleys, desolate fields, quiet streets, all tainted by the figure's silhouette. The first few times he saw it, he rationalized. It was a trick of the light, a smudge on the lens, a stranger caught unintentionally in the frame. But those excuses fell apart as the appearances grew bolder. The figure wasn't just in the shadows anymore. It stood in open spaces, visible but still. Watching, Ethan began scrubbing through his footage obsessively, pausing at every moment the figure appeared. It had no face, no distinguishing features, just an emptiness that seemed to mock his attempts at understanding. One clip made his blood run cold. The figure wasn't in the background this time. It was standing in a doorway, directly facing the camera. Its posture was unnervingly rigid, and its head was tilted slightly to one side, as if curious. Ethan shut his laptop with a snap, his breath hitching in his throat. The room felt colder, the air heavier. He knew it was irrational, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the figure wasn't confined to his videos anymore. Desperate for a sense of normalcy, Ethan ventured out to the local grocery store the next day. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a pale, sterile glow on the aisles. Ethan moved mechanically, filling his basket with coffee, bread, and canned soup. As he rounded a corner, he froze. At the end of the aisle, the figure stood perfectly still, framed between rows of cereal boxes. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. His basket slipped from his hands, clattering to the floor. He blinked, and the figure was gone. But the unease lingered. Ethan abandoned his groceries and left the store, his heart racing. That evening, Ethan sat at his desk, staring at his laptop. He hadn't touched the footage all day, too afraid of what he might find. The figure had crossed a line. It wasn't just a shadow lurking in his videos anymore. It was out there, in his world, interacting with him. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the radiator. Ethan glanced at the dark screen of his laptop, his reflection faintly visible in its surface. And then he saw it. Behind him, standing in the corner of the room, was the figure. Ethan spun around, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. But the corner was empty. When he turned back to the laptop, the reflection was gone. Unable to stay in his apartment, Ethan grabbed his camera and stormed into the street. The night was cold, the air sharp against his skin. The town was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that felt deliberate. He wandered aimlessly, his camera clutched tightly in his hands. The shadows cast by the flickering streetlights seemed deeper than usual, stretching unnaturally across the pavement. And then he saw it. Under the glow of a single street lamp, the figure stood. "Who are you?" Ethan shouted, his voice breaking the stillness. The figure didn't respond. It remained perfectly still, its head tilted in that same unnerving way. Ethan raised his camera, his hands trembling. He focused on the figure, but the screen distorted, static crawling across the display like ants. It was as if the camera couldn't process what it was seeing. Summoning what little courage he had left, Ethan took a step forward. Then another. The figure didn't move. It let him approach, its posture calm, almost inviting. When Ethan was just a few feet away, the figure tilted its head sharply. The motion was so sudden, so alien, that it sent a shiver down his spine. Ethan stumbled backward, his heart pounding. And then, without a sound, the figure vanished. Back in his apartment, Ethan replayed the footage from his encounter on the street. He expected static distortion, maybe nothing at all. But what he saw made him recoil in horror. The figure was there, clearer than ever. But it wasn't just standing, it was moving. In the video, as Ethan shouted at the figure, it turned its head, not with the slow, deliberate motion he had seen in person, but with an unnatural jerk, like a machine malfunctioning. And then it stepped forward. Ethan paused the video, his hand shaking. The figure's face was coming into focus now. Its edges were sharper, its features more defined. It was his face. Ethan sat frozen, his mind racing. The figure wasn't just following him, it was mimicking him. The tilted head, the stillness, the face. It was all a twisted reflection of himself. "What does this mean?" he whispered aloud, his voice shaking. But there was no answer, only the oppressive silence of his empty apartment. Ethan's reality had begun to crumble. The reflection in his laptop screen had shattered any illusion of safety. The figure wasn't just in his videos or distant corners of the world. It was here with him in his most personal spaces. He had tried to convince himself that it was paranoia, that stress and exhaustion were playing tricks on his mind. But denial was no longer an option. The figure was real, and it wasn't going away. That night, as Ethan sat in the dim glow of his laptop, the screen went black. The cursor blinked once, twice, and then words began to appear on their own. "You're not supposed to see this." Ethan froze. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, unsure of what to type. But before he could respond, the screen flickered, and an image replaced the text. It was the train station, dimly lit, its shadows deep and unyielding. The figure stood in the center of the frame, staring directly at the camera. Ethan's heart raced as the image distorted, lines of static creeping across the screen. And then the screen went black again. "What do you want from me?" Ethan whispered into the darkness. The laptop answered with a low, mechanical hum. The screen flickered back to life, but the desktop was empty. No messages, no images, as if nothing had happened. Over the next few days, Ethan began noticing strange anomalies in his apartment. Objects weren't where he had left them. His coffee mug, his keys, even his camera moved inexplicably. Cracks in the walls appeared and disappeared, as though the building itself were alive. Time itself felt warped. One afternoon, Ethan glanced at the clock on his wall and watched as the hands ticked backward for several seconds before snapping back into place. "What's happening to me?" he muttered. He tried calling a friend, someone who might ground him in reality. But every time he dialed, the call dropped before it connected. Even his internet connection faltered, web pages loading halfway before freezing entirely. The world around him felt less solid, less real. One evening, as Ethan scrolled through his older footage, he noticed something he hadn't before. The figure wasn't just a passive observer. In certain clips, its presence seemed to manipulate the environment. Shadows bent unnaturally around it. Objects moved subtly in its vicinity. And then he found it, a clip he'd filmed months ago at a foggy lake in another town. As the camera panned across the shoreline, the figure appeared briefly. But when Ethan paused the footage, he noticed something chilling. The figure wasn't looking at the lake. It was looking at him, not at the camera, at him. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He scrubbed through other clips, finding the same pattern. The figure's gaze was always focused on him, even when it was miles away. He leaned back in his chair, his mind reeling. This wasn't just a haunting. This wasn't just a glitch. The figure was aware of him. The next time the figure appeared, it didn't wait for Ethan to find it. It came to him directly. Ethan woke to the sound of static in the middle of the night. His laptop, which he'd shut down hours ago, was on again. The screen flickered with distorted images, shadows twisting and merging, shapes he couldn't quite make out. Then the screen went still, and the figure appeared. Ethan sat frozen in his chair, his breath shallow. The figure wasn't just a shadow anymore. Its edges were sharp, its form almost human. And then it spoke. "You're a part of it," the figure said, its voice a distorted echo of Ethan's own. Ethan's heart pounded. "What are you?" he whispered. The figure tilted its head. "I'm the truth you've been avoiding." "What truth?" The room seemed to vibrate as the figure stepped closer, its voice resonating in Ethan's mind. "This world isn't real. It's a simulation, and you've been asleep for a long time. Ethan shook his head, his mind racing. No, that's not possible. You've seen the cracks, the figure said. Objects moving. Team breaking. It's all failing. The simulation is collapsing, and you're waking up. Ethan clutched his head as fragmented memories surfaced. Memories that didn't belong to him. He saw a world in ruins, skies choked with ash, cities reduced to rubble. He saw pods, rows upon rows of them, each housing a person. He saw himself, asleep in one of them. This isn't real, he whispered. The figure nodded. Now you understand. The figure extended its hand, and the room around Ethan began to dissolve. The walls crumbled into ash. The floor disintegrated into darkness. Ethan found himself standing in an endless void, the figure still in front of him. You can go back, the figure said to the simulation. You can live in ignorance, in comfort. Or you can face the truth. Ethan hesitated, his mind spinning. What's the truth, he asked. The figure tilted its head again. Come with me, and you'll see. Ethan looked back at the remnants of his apartment, its familiar clutter and warmth fading into nothingness. Then he looked at the figure. I don't want to go back, he said. The figure stepped aside, revealing a faint light in the distance. Ethan took a deep breath and stepped forward. Ethan woke to the sound of his own ragged breath. The air was cold and sharp, stinging his lungs with every inhale. He blinked, his vision blurry, the dim blue light of his surroundings slowly coming into focus. He was lying in a pod, a metallic, frost-covered shell lined with wires and tubes that still clung to his arms and chest. His body felt alien, weak, and skeletal, as though he hadn't moved in years. When he tried to sit up, pain shot through his muscles, forcing him back down. He lay there for a moment, staring at the curved glass of the pod's lid. Beyond it, he could see rows of identical pods stretching endlessly into the darkness, their faint glow casting eerie reflections across the metallic walls. Where am I? He whispered, his voice hoarse. Summoning all his strength, Ethan reached for the latch on the pod's interior. The mechanism creaked as the lid hissed open, releasing a burst of cold, stale air. He pulled himself out slowly, his hands trembling as they gripped the edges. His legs buckled the moment they touched the ground, unable to support his weight. He collapsed onto the cold, metallic floor, gasping for air. His reflection stared back at him from the polished surface, a gaunt, hollow-eyed man with an unkempt beard and pallid skin. He barely recognized himself. The room was massive, the scale overwhelming. The pod stretched in every direction, some glowing faintly, others dark and empty. Ethan crawled to the nearest pod, peering inside. A woman lay motionless within, her face serene, her body untouched by time. The light from her pod flickered faintly, a sign of life, or perhaps something less certain. Ethan staggered to his feet, clutching at the pod for support. He called out into the void, his voice echoing back at him. Hello? Is anyone here? Silence answered. Ethan wandered the bunker, dragging his feet across the polished metal floor. The walls were covered in frost, and the air was thick with a chemical staleness that made his throat burn. Most of the pods he passed were dark, their glass cracked or their interiors empty. Others contained withered corpses, their bodies long since reduced to brittle husks. His footsteps led him to a control panel in the center of the room. Its holographic interface flickered to life as he approached, displaying lines of incomprehensible data and a map of the facility. At the top of the screen, bold red text flashed ominously. System failure. Simulation collapse imminent. Ethan stared at the display, his mind struggling to process what it meant. The simulation was gone. He was awake now, in the real world, but this world was nothing like he had imagined. Hours of wandering brought Ethan to a staircase, its steps caked with frost. He climbed slowly, his legs shaking with every step, his body unused to such exertion. At the top, he found a heavy metal door. It took all his remaining strength to push it open, the hinges groaning in protest. Cold wind struck him like a physical blow. Ethan staggered out into the open, shielding his eyes from the harsh light of the ash-gray sky. The world before him was dead. The ground was cracked and dry, littered with jagged rocks and the skeletal remains of buildings. A thick haze hung in the air, obscuring the horizon and giving the landscape a ghostly quality. Ethan took a shaky step forward, his bare feet crunching on the brittle earth. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint howl of the wind. He wandered through the ruins of what had once been a city. Rusted vehicles sat abandoned in the streets, their windows shattered and their frames twisted by time. Skyscrapers jutted out of the ground like broken teeth, their skeletal remains casting long shadows across the wasteland. Ethan searched desperately for signs of life, anything that might prove he wasn't alone. But every building he entered was empty, every corner devoid of movement. He found no food, no water. His body, already weak, began to betray him. His legs gave out frequently, forcing him to crawl over the rubble. But it wasn't hunger or thirst that frightened him most. It was the figure. It appeared at the edges of his vision, always just far enough away to evade scrutiny. Sometimes it stood in the shadows of a collapsed building. Other times it lingered on a distant hill, its head tilted in that same unnerving way. Ethan tried to ignore it, telling himself it wasn't real. But deep down he knew better. At the edge of the ruins, Ethan found a massive crater. The ground around it was scorched and cracked, as though something unimaginable had torn through the earth. In the center of the crater, faintly visible through the haze, was a glowing spiral symbol etched into the ground. The light it emitted was faint but steady, pulsing rhythmically like a heartbeat. Ethan stumbled down the slope, his body barely able to keep upright. When he reached the symbol, he dropped to his knees, his hand hovering over the glowing surface. The figure appeared behind him. Ethan turned, his breath catching in his throat. The figure stood at the edge of the crater, its form sharper and more defined than ever. "What do you want?" Ethan rasped. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it extended a hand, pointing toward the horizon. Ethan followed its gesture, his eyes narrowing against the haze. In the distance, faint but unmistakable, was a light. Ethan staggered toward the light, his body screaming in protest. Every step felt like a monumental effort, his vision blurring as exhaustion clawed at him. The figure followed at a distance, its presence a constant reminder that Ethan's journey was far from over. When he finally reached the source of the light, he collapsed to the ground. Before him stood a massive structure, smooth and metallic, its surface pulsating faintly with energy. The figure appeared beside him, silent as always. It raised a hand and pressed it against the structure. A door slid open, revealing a blinding white interior. Ethan hesitated, his mind racing with questions. But he was too weak to resist. He crawled toward the doorway, the light enveloping him as he crossed the threshold. The white light engulfed Ethan as he crossed the threshold. For a moment, there was nothing, no sound, no sensation, just an endless void of brilliance. Then the light dimmed, and Ethan found himself standing in a vast, featureless expanse. The ground beneath his feet was smooth and reflective, like polished glass. The sky above was an infinite, colorless haze, neither bright nor dark. He felt weightless, untethered, as though the laws of physics no longer applied. Ahead of him, the figure stood waiting. "You've brought me here," Ethan said, his voice echoing unnaturally. "Why?" The figure tilted its head, the gesture now familiar, but no less unnerving. "This is the truth," it said, its voice resonating in Ethan's mind rather than his ears. Ethan staggered forward, his body still weak and trembling. "What truth? What is this place?" "This is the end of the simulation," the figure replied. "The edge of reality. Beyond this, there is nothing." Fragments of memory began to surface in Ethan's mind, triggered by the figure's words. He saw himself as he had once been, healthy, vibrant, sitting in a sterile lab surrounded by monitors. He was speaking to someone, though their face was obscured. "The simulation is designed to preserve what remains," his past self said. "But if it fails, we need a contingency, a way to test if the subject is ready to wake up." Ethan gripped his head as the memories flooded him. He saw the creation of the simulation, the pods housing the last remnants of humanity, and the moment it all began to fall apart. He saw himself volunteering for the test, becoming the first subject to traverse the layers of the simulation. "You were never meant to remember," the figure said, stepping closer. "But the cracks forced you to wake up, and now you must choose." "Choose what?" Ethan asked, his voice trembling. The figure raised a hand, and the empty expanse around them shifted. The ground beneath Ethan's feet dissolved, replaced by the cracked, desolate earth of the wasteland. The ruins of the city loomed in the distance, their jagged silhouettes sharp against the ashen sky. "This is your reality," the figure said, "a world long dead. You can return to the simulation, where you will forget and live in comfort. Or you can remain here, in the truth." Ethan turned, his gaze falling on the glowing spiral symbol that had haunted him since the wasteland. It pulsed faintly in the void, a reminder of the choice he had made to leave the simulation. The figure gestured toward it. "Touch it, and you will return to the simulation. Stay here, and you will live out your days in the real world." Ethan stared at the symbol, his thoughts racing. The simulation had been a lie, but it had felt real. The colors, the sounds, the people. It was a life he could live without questioning. But this world, though empty and broken, was real. "What happens if I stay?" he asked. The figure didn't respond. Ethan dropped to his knees, his body trembling with exhaustion. The spiral glowed faintly before him, its light steady and inviting. Behind him, the wasteland stretched endlessly, silent and foreboding. "I don't want to go back," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I can't." The figure tilted its head again, but this time, it stepped aside. Ethan reached out, his fingers hovering over the spiral. But instead of touching it, he pulled back, his hand falling limply to his side. The symbol's light faded, and the void began to collapse around him. The wasteland stretched forward, consuming the last traces of the simulation. As the last vestiges of the void disappeared, Ethan found himself standing in the ruins once more. The air was thick with ash, the sky a swirling gray mass. But this time, he wasn't afraid. The figure stood at his side, silent and still. It no longer felt threatening, just a part of him, a shadow that had always been there. "What now?" Ethan asked, his voice steady. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it raised a hand and pointed toward the horizon. Ethan followed its gesture, his gaze settling on a faint glimmer of light in the distance. It was weak, barely visible through the haze, but it was there. He took a deep breath, his legs weak but determined, and began to walk. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe to the channel, and I'd love to hear your comments.